A day of thanksgiving kept in all the churches for our victories against the Pequots. John Winthrop. Hey, what's up, y'all? It's Mr. Ernest Crim the Third, your favorite Black History teacher, and welcome to episode 2 of the Crim Class podcast. I'm glad y'all are back with me. We got a lot to talk about. There's always so much going on in the world and so much going on in America, and I'm sure even in your immediate community. But before we get to that, you know how I do. If you listen to my first episode, we got to do a quick check-in. So before we proceed, let me know in the comments, let me know wherever you are, or maybe you even just talk to somebody near you or you talk to yourself. Think this out to yourself. How are you feeling right now on a scale from 1 to 10? Take some time to reflect on that. I hope this isn't the first time you've checked in on yourself since the last time we spoke and had class, but if it is, I'm glad I could remind you of the importance of doing this on a daily basis. So take some time to do that. How you feeling, fam? Now, for me, I would say I'm a legit 9 right now. I'm feeling good. At the time of this recording, I've gone through essentially every season that we could have. And you know how it is in the Chicago area. We started off this week with snow. It was 20-something degrees. As of this recording, it's about 60 right now. And I think we're going to close the week at about 70. So I've gone through every type of wardrobe change you could imagine. And I think for me, too, what helps me stay at this 9 is, look, as I'm recording this in November, it's also my birthday month. So shout out to my birthday month. I'm always feeling good around that fall season. Like this is when I came into this existence. So I'm always in a great mood for that. But also too, one thing that's contributing to my positive mindset in this moment, considering everything that's happening, is honestly less scrolling. Yeah, I'll be real with you. The less I scroll, the better I feel. And truthfully, I've been employing something that I would recommend to you as well. So what I've been doing recently, I've been doing a social media fast once a week, right? So every Sunday, I don't touch social media at all. I don't scroll. I don't get on there. I might have some posts scheduled, but I won't go on there and scroll through. And it's a great way for me to center myself, spend some extra time with my family, and then just get mentally ready for the week. We have to begin to really process that and do that a lot more. And let's look at our excessive social media usage as us overeating mentally and emotionally. So the more I take myself away from that and focus on being present in the moment, the better I feel. But regardless of how you feel, it's important for us before we move forward to do a little deep breathing, y'all. Let's center ourselves in this moment and then let's jump into the content. So here's what I want you to do. We're going to do a 3, 4, 5 breathing technique. We'll breathe in to the count of 3. We'll hold for 4 seconds, and then we'll breathe out for 5 seconds. And what this is going to do is going to help reset how you're feeling, y'all. It's going to help de-stress and declutter your mind in this exact moment. So we're going to count to 3. We're going to hold for 4. Then we're going to breathe out for 5 seconds. Let's breathe in, y'all. 1, 2, 3. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. And breathe out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now let's do it again without me prompting you, y'all. All right, let's get into it. So look, we have to have a timely conversation because as this topic came to mind, I could not help but think about a couple things. For one, the fact that we are in November as I'm recording this, and it is Indigenous Peoples Heritage Month. It's not something we talk about a lot. I know we have a lot of different months in America, but this is a very important month because it also correlates with Thanksgiving. And I want you to think about what your fondest memories of Thanksgiving are growing up. And of course, this would depend on your racial or ethnic background, right? But what are some of your fondest memories of Thanksgiving? What did it mean to you growing up? And I want us to also consider what that will mean in this country moving forward, because regardless of how we have celebrated it, it has often been tied not to the true history of it, not to family, not to gratitude, but honestly, in preparation, it's been tied to us preparing for capitalism overdrive season, which is essentially the shopping season for Christmas. Because all we truly hear about in preparation for Thanksgiving is Black Friday and getting ready to empty our pockets to overly spend our money for the holiday season, y'all. But where we stand now, it feels like more than ever, we're at a moment where things have to change. We have to more than ever reflect on how we got to this point in history so that we cannot make the same mistakes moving forward. And the unfortunate part of this reality is, regardless of when you play this back, it's still going to be relevant unless we begin to do something different. For a country that's built on the backs of a genocide and enslavement, for a country that supports genocide abroad, we have to reflect on how we got to that point so that we don't make the same mistakes moving forward, and celebrate the past so that the same things don't continue to happen. So here's what we commonly know and hear about Thanksgiving. And if this resonates with you as you hear it, you can just snap wherever you are, because I'm sure you can connect to being taught this growing up. The Thanksgiving feast happened in 1621. It lasted about 3 days, and it occurred sometime between late September and early November, which already that should throw you off, because we celebrated right the last, Thursday of November. That's not what it was like back then, though, right? This was attended by about 50 English colonizers and 90 Wampanoag people, including their leader, Massacre. Now, this first so-called Thanksgiving feast featured food that many of us would look at and really be disgusted by. It's not stuff that we currently eat or commonly eat. And in fact, if you think about some of the food that you enjoyed the most on Thanksgiving, this menu of items will completely throw you off. And it probably wouldn't even seem that special to you unless you live in certain regions of this country, right? Because I know some folks in the South, out there hunting, they still gonna eat some of this stuff. So the menu had venison, AKA deer. Y'all eating deer nowadays? It had wild fowl like duck, geese, seafood, and then some of the things we know like corn, vegetables, nuts, berries. So those same venison, those same deer that you sometimes hit while you're driving down those dark streets, those dark forest preserve streets, that was on the menu. The wild fowl, yeah, the duck, the geese that you almost hit, right? Yeah, they were on the menu as well. So that begs the question then, why do we even have turkey as a central part of our Thanksgiving feast here in America? What's interesting about that too is, it's like we all kind of know that's what we're going to be eating, right? That's going to be the center of every table for the most part come Thanksgiving. But why do we actually eat it? Well, turkey became a central Thanksgiving tradition in the mid to late 19th century, largely due to the efforts of a writer and editor named Sarah Josepha Hale. Now, how did she implement this? Well, for one, she was one of the main folks campaigning and lobbying to make Thanksgiving a national holiday in the 1800s. All right. She was also a famous chef, and she had recipe books out there. And this was something that she had in the books. It was practical for people because turkey was large and it was inexpensive and it was indigenous to America. So it became associated with this fictionalized version of this first Thanksgiving feast. And they would include this in the pictures. They would include this as a mention. And of course, by the time this becomes a national, federal holiday in 1863, that's what people have in their mind. But truthfully, it was nothing special about it except for the fact that it was large, it could feed a lot of people, it was already here, and it was affordable. I mean, and when we really narrow these things down, especially in our country, it's all about money. At some point, money's going to enter the conversation when we're talking about things like this. And it was affordable. So we ate it. And being real, it's not really that good. Let's be honest. I don't know how many of y'all really get down with turkey like that. Just me personally, it's cool. I could go without, you know. I'm going to have to make sure there's some gravy nearby. I'm going to have to make sure I put on some extra sauce, maybe some barbecue sauce, something like that. But it's not really all of that good to me. Maybe that's your thing. But that's how it enters this conversation. It was not there in the 1600s on that table for that feast, but it becomes a part of this conversation, our national lore and myth, because it was marketed to us. And I think that's the main thing we're going to have to really focus on today is the marketing of a myth, marketing of myths to us that become the truth for our lives in a deleterious way, of course. It's important for us to also understand, y'all, that this first so-called Thanksgiving was not some friendly feast that was planned between the pilgrims, the English colonizers, and the indigenous people of the land. This was something that just so happened to happen randomly. This was to form a political alliance for protection. The indigenous folks who were here, the Wampanoag people, were fearful of their lives during this time. They had already began to feel the impact of English colonizers coming to their land and their space, and they were also at war with other indigenous tribes. They sought protection. So they just so happened to see English folks setting up for a feast. They want protection. The English folks want protection, so they joined together. It was a survival strategy. So the indigenous people joined in on this dinner. And there was the assumption that an alliance was being formed. And they brought together the foods and their cultural practices together for this 3-day feast. It should also be understood that the indigenous people had been doing these harvest feasts for thousands upon thousands of years. This wasn't something new to them. This wasn't their first dinner with folks. This was just the first time they joined together with people who were English at this point in time in history. Because it's just like the conversation with Columbus when we talk about him so-called discovering America. We know that's not true, but that's when it was discovered for the Spanish, right? For Europeans at that time. So this was something that was usually done to commemorate the last bounty, to celebrate the bounty of land and observe spiritual and religious traditions and to give thanks to the Creator for a successful harvest season. Now, there wasn't a particular day they did it every single year, but it was usually around that time when summer was transitioning to fall. It was a dinner of gratitude. Now, this first feast was never actually even referred to as Thanksgiving during that time. And in fact, Edward Winslow's account describes the event. He was a person who was there, and he gives us the only firsthand account some months later that year, but he does not describe it as Thanksgiving. He essentially says it was a harvest celebration after a brutal first winter. But let's have some more context with that, because why would the indigenous people be fleeing for their safety, fleeing for their lives in this situation, and be clamoring for anybody to align with them, to help protect them and what they're dealing with? So this so-called first Thanksgiving is happening in 1621. Now, we know that the pilgrims, the colonizers, the settlers, whatever you want to call them, they didn't come there in 1621. So what was happening from the time that they landed in that area in 1607, the early 1600s? We have an event that has been referred to as the Great Dying. The horrific dying is what I would call it, but it's commonly referred to as the, quote, Great Dying. From 1616 to 1619, up to 90% of indigenous coastal populations were killed in this area. Over the 100 years after European arrival, the indigenous population in America dropped from 60 million to only 6 million. waves of epidemics, warfare, famine, irregular warfare is the term I really want us to be familiar with, because this is the type of warfare that indigenous people were targeted with. That was something that was just so foreign to them. This was warfare that targeted not the people who were only in direct combat or were expected to fight, which was usually men at the time. This was warfare that was also targeting women, targeting children, targeting people while they slept, targeting the elderly, targeting people who are our most vulnerable populations who would not otherwise be involved in warfare. It was total warfare. So in that 3-year period, coastal folks are dying, being killed, diseases. And even 100 years priorly, millions of them are falling victim to this genocide, the epidemic, the warfare. Think about that context leading up to that dinner, right? That feast. Think about what that mindset would have been like for the indigenous people at that point in time. What's also important to note is after this period of great dying that is referred to as 1616 to 1619, King James I, the guy who commissioned the popular King James Version of the Bible, the third English translation of the Bible, he said something very interesting around that time as well that I think we should take note of, especially as someone who commissioned a translation of a version of the Bible that is wildly popular. King James I said, and I quote, "Within these late years, there hath, by God's visitation, reigned a wonderful plague, the utter destruction, devastation, and depopulation of that whole territory. So as there is not left any that do claim or challenge any kind of interest therein. We, in our judgment, are persuaded and satisfied that the appointed time has come in which Almighty God, in his great goodness and bounty towards us and our people, hath thought fit and determined that those large and goodly territories, deserted as it were by their natural inhabitants, should be possessed and enjoyed by such our subjects." Close quote. That was said by King James, the guy who commissioned a wildly popular version of the Bible that maybe you read from on a daily basis, or maybe your pastor refers to. Think about what that means for that version of the Bible, and think about what that means for how Christianity was practiced and implemented then and beyond. To him, it was a blessing that the indigenous people were wiped out during this great dying period. That is maniacal. That is sociopathic. But for him, this was a great thing. This was a godly thing. And that was also the thing they used to justify what they did. Should not have been done, but they used it, I guess, to make them feel better about what was occurring. Now, so after this dinner ends, the question then is, well, like, what happened to this treaty that they were forming? What happened to this political alliance? Well, look, the best way I can describe this so-called political alliance is, it did not last. Well, we have the proof, right? We know that this dinner, this feast happened in 1621, and it was like, I'm going to look out for you. You're going to look out for me, and we got each other's back. Well, if that happened, if that was the actual case, then I think that we would see history unfold completely different. You know what? Let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story about just how these treaties have been broken over the course of time and how proof is right in front of our faces most times. So when I was in the classroom, I had to proctor the SAT exam one year, which is something you always have to do as a teacher. You get they pretty much assign you a classroom and you have to read what the SAT says and give kids time to take the test and so on and so forth. One year I happened to be appointed with this legend of a man named Joseph Baltz. He was a photography teacher at the school I was at. And I had heard about him. I had knew of him, but I had not really ever had a chance to talk to him. He knew I was a history teacher. And I think he may have heard about me before too. So after the kids were done taking the test, we had a chance to talk a little bit, and he shared some local history with me about indigenous people in the area in the Joliet region of Illinois that completely shocked me because I had no idea about it. He detailed to me where local indigenous mounds were, so proof of indigenous people being here, and also, of course, where they buried themselves at. He talked to me about a street that I had driven past before, but it had never occurred to me that it was connected to indigenous history. And this street was called Indian Boundary Road. And he's telling me about it now. At this time, of course, we're not supposed to have our phones and stuff because we're proctoring an exam. So I couldn't look it up at that moment, but I remembered everything he said. And he told me that street, it runs, from Plainfield, and it goes through Joliet, it goes through Chicago. And it was called that name because it was where a boundary line was where indigenous folks and Americans agreed not to pass, to respect each other's territory. And when you look this up, it's very fascinating because you begin to find out that this indigenous history that we talk about is not just history, y'all, that is where the Wampanoag were, where the Pilgrims were on the East Coast. It's not just where Columbus was. It's literally everywhere we walk. It's everywhere we drive. It's everywhere we go in this country that we now call the United States of America. Consider, it hasn't really been that long since this country actually even had that name. In 2026, America celebrates 250 years for declaring independence, but not really 250 years of really being free because that war didn't end until 1783. So when you even consider that, it makes America that much younger. So from the 1600s to the late 1700s, there are colonies here, and there are people fighting to create something that had not yet existed. And when I say fight, I mean waging war against the indigenous people here, killing them, massacring them. And we can go even beyond that with 1492 and Columbus and the Spanish, right? But I'm saying that to say that there were people here for a lot longer than they weren't. So that should make you wonder and be curious about what local history related to Native Americans and indigenous folks have you overlooked and aren't aware of? Because after that conversation, of course, I looked up an article. I did some more research on Indian Boundary Road. I've made a few videos actually about them on social media. And it's literally about a 10-minute drive from me. It's right around the corner. And it's placed now in a suburban neighborhood in Plainfield. And there's a part of that street that goes to a cornfield. And imagine what used to be there, right? And it even goes through Chicago, right? I think there's an Indian Boundary Park in Chicago right now on the north side, I believe. It's right there for us to see. These broken treaties, these agreements that did not go through fully, where one side, the European colonial side, did not uphold their end of the bargain, is evidenced by how expansive this land is right now. Because if there was a firm understanding or a compliance with that treaty of Indian Boundary Road, for example, then the line that is America would be vastly different. If there was a true indigenous and European alliance that formed from that feast, the America as we know would be completely different. Which makes me even wonder too, what's the validity of a contract in this nation, right? What's the validity of the written word? I know we want to enter into legal agreements. I know that's very important here in this culture, but what's the validity of it? What's the validity of a law, right? When you can have the lawmakers in your pocket or the Supreme Court and they can make any decision that you want them to do. It's really interesting the way we see this connection with those broken treaties with what we see happening right now with our president in the Supreme Court. Like we have a president right now in the Supreme Court that is fighting, as I'm recording this, they're fighting to starve people. There are funds available to give people, but they are fighting to say, no, starve those folks. which is honestly very reminiscent of what happened to the indigenous people. Because the warfare that they faced, again, irregular warfare, wasn't just on a battlefield, guns blazing, bow and arrows. It wasn't just that. It was also destroying the food source, killing the buffalo, the bison, killing the things that they would need to eat. So when I look at that, and then I see what's happening here, and I think about us commemorating a so-called holiday of gratitude and thankfulness and coming together to eat while simultaneously having leaders fight to starve people, which is the direct antithesis of what this is supposed to be about. I can't help but think that this is commonplace here in America. And all we have to do is read the books and find out how that's true. So that's a broken treaty, evidence of that. This street that I can drive down at any point, Indian Boundary Road, which again, I cringe whenever I hear Indian referring to indigenous people, but hey, whatever, right? That's evidence of broken treaties, evidence of genocide. The indigenous mascots we see, without them having any say-so on how they want to be represented. I mean, it wasn't too long ago that we had a football team named the Washington Redskins, y'all. That was through 2020. Literally, bounties were paid for colonists to kill and behead indigenous people. They called the bounties, they called the heads they brought back to prove that they were victorious Redskins. And that was deemed okay. You don't have to go too far to even think the Cleveland Indians, for example. I think they're the Guardians now, and I think the Washington football team, they're the Commanders, right? They never come back with really like creative names either. Like what is it with that? The Commanders? That's the best you can do. It's almost like a slight. Like, okay, we can't have this indigenous name. All right, we're going to think of the worst possible mascot name after the Washington Commanders, brothers. Come on. And then with Cleveland, you go from Cleveland Indian, and the caricature of the Indian mascot they used was so disrespectful. We call it blackface. That's red face right there, the way they did that. The Guardians. Come on. The Guardians? And in my beloved birthplace, Chicago, I mean, hey, the Blackhawks are named after a leader who they were in warfare with, who was defeated after being victorious several times, but he was defeated for his land. Now he's a mascot. So after that feast happens, that treaty doesn't last, that alliance doesn't last, and through the 1620s and 30s, we began to see growing violence. Now, this growing violence from this time period, I would say, reaches its apex with the Pequot War and the Mystic Massacre that happened in the midst of that. So during this Mystic Massacre in 1637, which was a part of the Pequot War, 500 adults and children were killed by English colonists. According to the Zen Education Project, a pre-dawn attack on the Mystic Fort that left 500 adults and children of the Pequot tribe dead. This was the first defeat of the Pequot people, the first defeat by the Pequot people. I want y'all to hear that. The first defeat by the Pequot people, by the English in the Pequot War. And this was a 3-year war that was instigated by the Puritans to seize the tribe's traditional land, close quote. A couple things to understand about this. For one, this is 16 years after this first initial so-called Thanksgiving feast, right? 16 years later, the English were losing this war. Keep that in mind. Again, they were losing this war. So they launched, as an aspect of irregular warfare, a pre-dawn attack. So folks are sleeping. The kids are sleeping. The children are sleeping. The men are sleeping. The elderly, everybody's sleeping. And all of a sudden, gunshots, blood splattering, right? 500 left dead. Let's keep reading. And this is from the Young Reader's version of an indigenous people's history of the United States. And I quote, Pequots were living in two forts. In one fort were mainly Pequot men. In the other were primarily women, children, and elders. Mason targeted the latter. He was a mercenary. Slaughter ensued after killing most of the Pequot defenders. The soldiers set fire to the structures and burned the remaining people there alive. They burnt them alive. Though the Puritan slaughter of the Pequots was devastating, they continued to fear retaliation by the surviving Pequots who had sought refuge among neighboring nations. The fear was so great that they destroyed Pequots' remaining homes and food supplies and forced them to leave their homeland, close quote. A couple things for us to dissect right there, y'all. Again, remember, this is a pre-dawn attack. This is a part of irregular warfare. This was something that was very foreign to many of the indigenous folks here. Even when they engaged in warfare, there was often a certain level of respect to it, to the point where when they're fighting with other indigenous groups, you're not killing the women, the children, the elderly. You're not launching total war, pre-dawn attacks, right? So this irregular warfare catches them off guard. Some are killed instantly, and some are burned alive in 1637. In addition to that, those who remain had their homes destroyed and food supplies destroyed as well. When I see stuff like that and I read stuff like that, I can't help but think about what's happening now. Our most vulnerable people of any background who are depending on their SNAP benefits. This is our tax money. We always have to remember that. We're not talking about the government giving us something. We're talking about our money, right? This is something that has been instituted, we could say, since the Great Depression. It started there temporarily with FDR. It was reignited with JFK. And keep in mind, JFK became president in the early 60s. So we only talking, it ain't even been 70 years. He launched a pilot program. LBJ made it permanent. That's like really not even a lifetime. When you think my parents were born before this became a thing. By electing these folks, JFK, LBJ, we were saying then, especially during that time, that we want our tax money to be used to feed people. And now we're at a point in time, ain't that crazy, right? How we can devolve politically. How do we not grow? How were our presidents more progressive in the 60s of all time periods than they are now? How does that happen? We are again at a point now, just like with that Pequot massacre, in the midst of that war, the Mystic Massacre, where food supplies were being destroyed and burned in 1637. Nearly 400 years later, that's the equivalent to me. Food supplies are being burned and destroyed so people can suffer. You don't do that to people that you have love for and gratitude for, because you would do whatever you can as a public servant to make sure that people have their basic needs met. We're not talking about giving people money to just go spend it on lavish things and luxury items. We're saying that this money that you have can only be spent for food. You can't do nothing else with it. The connections, y'all, the connections. We have to, as we explore history, this is the whole purpose of this. We have to see how history is cyclical. It's not linear, it's cyclical. And we have to be able to process and analyze what are the cycles that we constantly see happening in every generation. And which of these cycles are harmful, which are beneficial, and what can we do to reduce that harm? That's all this is. Let's not make this difficult. I know that when you're learning history in school, it primarily functions as a mechanism of teaching propaganda and American exceptionalism. But we have to be able to move beyond that if we want something better. And when I say something better, I mean something that benefits all of us, right? Again, don't phrase it as the government is giving us this or the government decided to stop funding this. They decided to stop using our money the way we wanted it to be used. And maybe some of that is the fault of the way we voted, right? Because we give them the power. And that's another thing we have to truly understand. They are essentially employees of us. They burnt the remaining homes and the food supplies and forced them to leave their homelands. Close quote right there, y'all. So this gruesome defeat, it marked a turning point in this war in which the Pequots and their allies had been winning for 8 months. But they began to lose because of the irregular war tactics. Now, of course, there ain't no referee out there, so who's to say that's too far? We can feel it in our conscience. We don't think it's right, but who's going to stop them? Total war, devastation. After this massacre and genocide, y'all, Governor John Winthrop declared it a day of thanksgiving. He declared the end result of that massacre, the Pequot Massacre in 1637, as a day of thanksgiving. That is the first time we see that term primarily used. A day of thanksgiving for a massacre. Now, what does it sound like to you? What I said earlier, what King James I said after that so-called Great Dying period. He felt that God bestowed that to them, that it was a blessing that the indigenous people were dying off and were being killed to make space for them. The original inhabitants are gone because God blessed us with this land, right? And then that term eventually becomes manifest destiny. But that's the common theme. Because you are diabolical, because you are greedy, avaricious, and you want to just keep extending and keep taking things, you want to use religion, spirituality, and God to justify it. And this governor did the exact same thing, a day of thanksgiving. But that's still 1637. That has no connection, right, to that feast that happened in 1621. But in many ways, it actually does. Because that was the desire. The desire was not to come here to live in harmony with the indigenous people of this land. The desire was to come here and take that land and remove anybody that was in the way. And what's so eerie about this land now, because just like I told you, if I go to Indian Boundary Road, going through Joliet, Illinois, or Plainfield, Illinois, there's no historical marker. The only way you know it connects to what happened is the street name, and you would have to have a historical mind or a curious mind to say, I wonder why they called it that, and then you do some research. There's no historical marker, though, and that's what I really want to say, too. Like, understand, every name has a history behind it. I heard my brother Dilla say that before, man. Every name has a history behind it, so look it up. Look it up, especially if it's something that just doesn't seem to go with the area, right? If you in a mostly white suburb and you see something named an Indian something, look it up and see. You might be shocked and surprised, right? Every name has a meaning and history behind it. And for me, it has an etymology behind it, even beyond that. Because even like, why are we still saying Indian? But that was common then. It shouldn't be common now. Columbus and them were nowhere near India. All right. With that said, the spot where this Pequot massacre took place is now in Mystic, Connecticut. So that fort, Mystic, Connecticut, it was Fort Mystic then. It's a street. Looks like a suburban street with a turnabout in the middle. Can you imagine that? Like that, to me, with the historical mind I have, the first thing I'm thinking about is, dang, how many massacres have I driven past and had no idea? I mean, really, like, I'm likely living on one of those right now. with no historical landmark. That's what we have to reckon with. And to quote the great poet and artist, KRS-One, there would never truly be justice on stolen land. So we have to come to peace with what actually happened, because what actually happened is still happening unless we intervene with that cycle. So that begs the question then, so why do we call it Thanksgiving if that first initial feast, which happened, wasn't actually even called Thanksgiving? And again, the food, all that stuff was different, right? And we hear Thanksgiving popularized really in that time period after a massacre in which the very indigenous people who were at this feast were killed off, burnt alive, food destroyed, right? So the first Thanksgiving label was invented by a guy named Alexander Young. And it's important to remember that these harvest feasts, which had been happening for thousands of years with indigenous folks, continued as a tradition to here with European colonizers who were here. All right. So they were still having these celebrations over the course of years. But that name of Thanksgiving, that wasn't something that was actually associated with it in that respect. So he popularizes this in the 1840s. And for me, this is essentially proof of what I like to call myth making for the taking. Myth making for the taking. This was over 200 years after that feast, right? It had nothing to do with gratitude, nothing to do with friendship. It was a political dinner, basically. It's like, let's just eat together and let's protect each other, hopefully, right? But 200 years later, Alexander Young, this white dude, pastor, he has access, right? He has social access to create a narrative that can spread and become an element of propaganda. 1841, 20 years before the Civil War started. But as a historian, what you have to really know is the Civil War was in the process of starting every single year that slavery existed here. Because while all of this is happening, let's not forget, slavery is happening, right? During the Pequot Massacre and all that type of stuff, slavery is still a thing. I tell my kids when they're taking history class now, like, yo, look, any period of time you talking about up through 1865 in American history, you need to always be asking yourself or even ask a teacher, okay, what were black people and indigenous people doing during this time? Because if it was in the 1780s, American Revolution, whatever, slavery was there, yep. And there were black folks trying to fight for freedom on both sides of the American Revolutionary War, yep. Indigenous people's land was still being taken, yep. And if we talk in 1830s, 1840s, same thing happened. And even beyond that, through 1965 or 1968, we need to also still be asking, yeah, what were black people doing? Because if it's 1940, 50, we talking Jim Crow, right? So there's so many things to consider. In order for us to create a real picture of what life was like then, to have a better idea of why life is so inequitable now, we have to include all perspectives. And we cannot just think that it's just the European perspective that should be taught. We got to look at what were women doing? What were black folks doing? What were the indigenous folks doing? What were Asians doing, right? What were Latinos doing? This helps us gain a fuller picture. Myth making for the taking. So what this brother, Alexander Young wanted to do was he wanted to connect the Puritans, those so-called pilgrims, to a noble moral origin story for America. Because by the mid-1800s, New England elites were growing very anxious that their cultural and religious influence was declining. Now get this, they felt this way because immigration was growing. And it's not the same way we think of it now, right? Because immigration during that time, we're talking primarily European migration. They were growing nervous of a new wave of poor white folks coming over here and taking away the things that they felt were true American values. There's industrialization happening, westward expansion based on the philosophy of manifest destiny, meaning they felt that God ordained them to spread westward. So these New England elites who may have been here since the 1600s were very nervous about their place in society. They felt they were being replaced. Does that sound familiar? The great replacement theory that some espouse today. They felt they were being replaced. So Alexander Young, like many historians of this era, wanted to reassert New England's place as a foundation of this nation's moral and historical vision. He wanted people to know, like, don't forget, this is where it started. This is where this quote unquote great nation began. And this is our origin story. So he called the 1621 feast, right, that we knew about, but didn't really have an understanding of it the way that he was about to say. He called this feast the first Thanksgiving to create a spiritual and civic lineage that linked the pilgrims' supposed piety and gratitude to the America of his time. He wanted to romanticize that era, even though there was genocide and enslavement happening, right? Because if we look at the first Africans who were brought for enslavement, that's 1619, right? 1619, 1621. That's all overlapping. He wanted to assert America of that time through this dinner, through this feast, as a moral, pietous nation, a morally upright nation, a Christian nation of gratitude, so that that same feeling could be felt in the 1840s. Why was this so important for him to assert during this time? Remember, with every piece of land that America takes as the settler colonial state expands, the debate of this time in the 1830s and 40s is, will it be free or will it be slaves? The Civil War is brewing 20 years before it even happens, 20 years before Abraham Lincoln takes office. And we are disorganized. We are not united as a nation. We are, in many ways, you think about where we are right now, we are where we were, basically, if that makes sense to you. Because through every period of American history, you can find some type of link to what's happening today. Or he wanted to take that story and create a myth around it as to say that what they were currently doing to perpetuate the genocide and enslaving of people was okay. It was permissible. And in fact, we were all friends who came together. This reminds me of the Lost Cause. What the Daughters of the Confederacy did after the Civil War, they created a myth of Black people not wanting to be freed from enslavement. We have to be very aware of this because it happens in every generation, romanticizing the past so that you can continue to implement those same oppressive tactics in the present. Myth making for the taking. That's what it is. Now, where we stand in this moment, the same thing is happening because you got to keep in mind, why is there an effort to pad the pockets of billionaires and make a trillionaire? And then why at the same time is there effort to starve people? And why is there effort to give us longer mortgages? And why is there effort to starve the American people and have less money in our pockets while at the same time, simultaneously, of course, increasing healthcare premiums, and at the same time, let's not forget this, at the same time, who else are they focusing on? This is total war, right? Irregular warfare. We're also censoring what kids learn. Let's keep all of that in mind, right? Starving adults, making sure adults don't have access to SNAP, which subsequently is starving children and the elderly. About 60% of all SNAP recipients, right? Children, elderly. You're doing that. Healthcare premiums up. Billionaires getting richer. Right? The price of everything going up. And at the same time, you're saying, wait, I want to make sure that your children aren't really learning the truth about history. Why is that something that you're so concerned about at the same time you're concerned about making all of this money helping helping expand the American empire abroad, using our tax money to fund genocide, bombing Latino folks in South America for no reason at all. You're doing all of that, and then you're also saying, hey, let's make sure kids don't learn the truth about slavery. Let's make sure they don't learn the truth about labor uprisings. Let's sanitize that. It's because, y'all, it's myth making for the taking. Because after a certain time period pass and a generation is removed, that memory can be lost, right? I was born in the 80s. So everything that I'm aware of from the early 80s, the 70s, the 60s, and beyond is based on books I've read, documentaries, movies, right? Articles, primary sources, and talking to people. So they know that we are directly disconnected with that time, but from that time period holds the secrets and the lessons we need to learn from to implement today. So how do we go back to that? If we're not learning it in school, we talk to people. So the mission is, the goal is censor it so they can't learn correctly, so they can't learn what was done successfully then. But on the flip side, we'll keep our memory of what we did nefariously that worked successfully in our mind so that we can continue the same pattern of destruction. It's myth making for the taking. It's create historical amnesia. You know, the little man in black little pen thing that they would use and zap, you forgot everything and give you a whole new playbook. They don't want you to be aware of the atrocities of the past so that they can continue to implement them today. And which, of course, would allow them to implement them in the future. Because if they're doing it right now, presently, they're going to do it again. And they follow the same pattern. Let's sanitize the history books, y'all. Let's make it seem like that first feast was just one that was centered on friendship and gratitude and a promising relationship that would grow and develop over the course of centuries in New England, as opposed to telling the truth about what led to it, what happened after, how that Thanksgiving term was used in 1637, and how those same patterns happen today. If they didn't care about the indigenous people then, and we see we're currently funding genocides right now across the world, and we see that they are currently, actively, aggressively attempting to starve people, primarily children and the elderly, then what makes you think that the mindset of then is different from the mindset of today? Things don't get better with time, y'all. They get better when we make them better. And we can't make them better unless we understand the root cause of why they ain't better now. And this is why this is so important. Myth making for the taking. What it did what Alexander Young did during this time was promote unity through nostalgia and moral simplicity. So instead of focusing on abolition debates and industrial labor unrest and the sectional tension that I was talking about, we focus on this simple idea of us coming together for dinner. It became a usable myth, y'all, for moral education, especially in schools and sermons. Practice gratitude, be thankful, be like the Indians and the Pilgrims. And, you know, some of y'all kids will dress up in those roles for Thanksgiving for their school. It's myth making for the taking. The kids still learned about Columbus, right, in a positive way. They still learn about Thanksgiving in a positive way without all the extra context. So Alexander Young took a 3-day harvest feast that no one called Thanksgiving and turned it into America's moral origin story. Why? Because by the 1840s, New England wanted to remind the rest of the country that its Protestant roots still defined the nation's soul, while indigenous genocide and slavery continued. wanted to remind them that this is where y'all came from as the nation is changing and evolving. Don't forget, as the nation is expanding and talking about slavery, conducting more genocide, don't forget, this is who we are at our core. And who we are at our core is a comfortable lie. And this myth was something that was used in textbooks moving forward. This myth is something that you know about. Maybe you can't pinpoint exactly when you were taught it, but you know it. Whether it was in school, whether it was from friends, whether it was from the media, the Thanksgiving Day parades, right? We all know it. And every single one of these myths serve a political purpose. It's never neutral. The information, the education we get in this country, y'all, it's never neutral. It serves a purpose. And the purpose it serves is exactly what you see happening right now in this country. So, with that said, y'all, it's time to wind down. And I got to explain to you what your life work is now. You can call it homework. I'm calling it life work because homework feels like something you would do from 1st through 12th grade just because a teacher told you. I'm telling you this for the benefit of humanity. All right. I need you to read. And with that, imagine the creation of different social structures. The things we abide by now, y'all, are creations of humanity that were enforced at the tip of the gun. And it has become common. We have been indoctrinated with them, which means that we can create something new. And we have to begin where we are and start where we are. And that, of course, starts with the foundation of education. That starts with our households and our community. Much of what I learned that I talked about today comes from this book that I've had on my screen the whole time. An Indigenous People's History of the United States. I need you to read that. You can't really understand American history without understanding the people who were here first. Okay? The original inhabitants. That book is by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. When you read that, you'll see what I mean. So check that book out, y'all, for sure. I also got to big up my brother, Dr. Wes Bellamy. Got a new book, Nobody's Coming to Save Us. I need y'all to check that out. The Black Print for Leadership. This brother is somebody you want to make sure you following online, Dr. Wes Bellamy, and somebody you're just following in general. This book right here is going to help us dig into what we need to be doing in this moment, right? Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book is going to let you know the foundation of this. And Dr. Bellamy's book is going to let us know what we can do moving forward. And of course, I got to mention my own book. Make sure you're reading How Black History Can Save Your Life. You should have that by now. You know what I'm saying? That's why I mentioned it last. You should have it by now. If you don't, add it to your cart. Indie bookstores preferred. Black-owned bookstores preferred above all. And I end this class the way I started it, with the quote. And this quote is by the author of that first book, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Thanksgiving is the day of national amnesia, when the myth of the founding gets reheated to cover up the violence that followed. Thank y'all for listening. I'll see you next time on Crim Class.